and welcome to Talking Cannabis. Thank you for joining us today. Good morning, Kenny.
Good morning, Todd.
Yeah, good. Today we have Mel Frank with us on the panel. We also have, of course, Tom Alexander, and we have Sam the Skunk Man. And then today our special guest is Jeff Lowenfels. Jeff is the author of a lot of great books, actually. His latest was Teaming with Fungi. He also did Teaming with Microbes and Teaming with Nutrients. And all around amazing guy. Jeff, welcome to the show today, and thank you for joining us.
My pleasure, and thanks for having me. I can't think of a better group of people to be with.
That's really cool. Well, you know, the floor is yours. We wanted to open it up and let you talk about your books and what you do. You've had an astonishing career of over 40 years writing about the cultivation of many plants. And please, the floor is yours.
Well, it's hard to figure out where to begin. I am, well, maybe the way to do this is just to go through a little talk that I give on the soil food web. Many, many years ago, I was a gigantic Miracle-Gro user. And thanks to Tom Alexander here, I became a soil food webbie, and I started giving this talk around the country. This talk morphed into the first book. Parts of this became the second book, and then parts of it became the third book. So I think if we go through it, maybe spend 30, 40 minutes going through it, you can interrupt me at any time and ask any questions, and we'll just sort of run through it and see what it's all about. Of course, it started out with Teaming with Microbes, which I wrote in 2006 as a result of working on a project here in Alaska, whereby we were moving a product called Alaska Humus, a very, very special soil we have up here that gets thrown into the landfill because you can't build on it. It was being sent down to the landfill, and we figured out a way to ship it out to the lower 48 states. That led to a second book called Teaming with Microbes, Teaming with Nutrients, which is basically how plants eat. And then the third book, Teaming with Fungi. And now that I have a trilogy, I like to call myself, of course, Lord of the Roots. It's kind of silly. Anyway, sort of get down to business here. This is an Alaskan sled dog doing his business. You know, when I first started gardening, and probably when you did as well, none of us owned our own telephone. There were just tremendous numbers of magazines and even tremendous numbers of gardening magazines. And really, you know, it was sort of a fun time because there was all this new stuff that was happening. We were getting aluminum foil was invented. Plastic was a real big, you know, kind of thing. And we ended up with all sorts of stuff. I don't know if I can get my computer to work this thing out. Is it moving there? I don't know.
We just see you.
Yeah, plastic. How about that? Now better?
No, it's just you.
Oh, it's just me. I thought I was running through my slides here. And no wonder. I'm kind of.
You got to click the thing on the left there.
Yeah, you know, I didn't learn anything about using technology, and now I'm completely gone. There we are.
Really cool. We appreciate you taking the time to give us a personal side.
No problem. I was getting to the best part of the story, which is about Tom Alexander. So
you guys have been friends for how long, can I ask, while you're sorry?
Oh, my God. We go back 25, 30 years, maybe. I don't know.
Yeah.
Pretty long.
We met at the Garden Writers. Somehow at these conferences, people that consume cannabis always coagulate together. And
of course, this was a long time ago, too, wasn't it?
Yeah.
I'm kind of clicking on this thing, and it didn't doing it. I might not have enough bandwidth. Anyway, one day, Tom, we used to go to these meetings, and Tom and I would argue about, you know, and I would argue with everybody about organic versus non-organic. And I just wish I could get this screen share thing to open up, which I can't. It says it's opening, but it's not. Anyway, Tom and I and all these guys, we'd argue about it. And I would say to people, listen, it didn't matter to a plant whether nitrogen comes from a brown manure or whether it comes from a green powder. It's nitrogen. The plant doesn't give a damn. And, you know, people would say, well, yeah, but, you know, yeah. And nobody could really explain why it made a difference to a plant to have nitrogen come from Miracle-Gro or whether it could come from manure. And one day, I'm sitting and minding my own business up in Anchorage, Alaska, and Tom Alexander sends me an email with a picture of a nematode being strangled by a fungal hyphae. and the nematode is trying to get into a tomato root, and the fungal hyphae is protecting the tomato root. Unbelievable picture. It was about, oh God, 1998. I don't know when it was. I mean, it was a really early electron microscope picture, and it was a mind blower, an absolute mind blower, because it took me a long time, first of all, to figure out what I was looking at, and second of all, to figure out that this was a fungal hyphae killing an animal. Well, wait a second, that didn't make any sense to me. I'd never seen anything like it before. I had no idea, what it was. And then he wrote these words, soil food web you lose, down at the bottom of the picture. And so I had to figure out what the soil food web was in order to figure out why I lost. And I spent hours and hours, I mean 2-3 days, going through the internet. And again, this is back in the early days, looking for references about the soil food web. What's the soil food web? Anyway, I finally found this picture, very complicated diagram, mentions Dr. Elaine Ingham. I couldn't understand a thing on it, and it had these words like mycorrhizal fungi and bacterial-eating nematodes and all this stuff that I, just wasn't familiar with at all. And at the time, I had been writing a garden column probably, I don't know, maybe 30 years. And I'd never heard of a mycorrhizal fungi. I'd never heard any of these things on this chart. And so I spent a long time researching what was on this chart so I could understand why Tom thought I lost the argument about organic versus non-organic. Anyway, it turns out that what I discovered was the soil food web. I didn't discover the soil food web. I discovered what the soil food web was. Tom knew, lots of other people knew. I had no idea. But it took me by storm when I learned that photosynthetic energy, most of it goes to producing things that drip out of the plant's roots. The nearest comparison is sweat. We're all sitting around here right now. We are dripping out exudates. And that exudate that we're dripping out is attracting bacteria and fungus to our skin. And they're eating the exudate, our sweat. The same thing happens around the roots. The photosynthetic energy produces carbon-based products that are dripped out of the root system that are eaten by bacteria and fungus. And they love it because they need the carbon. They can't produce their own. They're having a great time eating this stuff. And then along come nematodes, these worms, these blind worms, and protozoa, the things we studied in high school, paramecium and amoebas and all that kind of stuff. We had no idea why we were studying them. We were studying them because you could see them and the bacteria were too small. And they eat the bacteria and the fungus. And they eat the bacteria and the fungus for the same reason the bacteria and fungus are eating the exudates. They need carbon. And they eat some of the other stuff. They use the other nitrogen and some of the other stuff that's in the bacteria and fungus. They poop out whatever is excess. And the excess stuff contains nitrogen and other nutrients in plant usable form. So what's happening is the plant is attracting the food that it needs, and the food attracts what eats it, and the poop feeds the plant. Unbelievable system. This is the soil food web, and then of course you got the bigger guys eating the nematodes, and so it goes all the way up to us. And whoa, blew my mind. I had no idea that plants attracted their own food, that you don't have to feed plants, And I went boing, why do the redwoods get that big? They're 500 years old. They're 750 feet tall. My God, how do they get that way without any Miracle-Gro? Well, it's these microbes. This is the system that feeds the plants. Well, it was sort of like discovering geometry in 9th grade to me. I loved geometry. Holy crow, all of a sudden something fit together. It made sense. It had simple rules. One thing led to another. Wow, I loved it. And that was the same thing with this soil food web. It's just fabulous. It's just such a beautiful system. And you can tinker with it and you can tweak it, and you discover that your soil has either fungal domination or bacterial domination, depending on whether it's acidic, fungal, or bacterial, which would be above a pH above 7. And you can make teas, and you can make designer composts, and you start out thinking, and you can grow better tomatoes, and then all of a sudden you figure out that you can grow some of the biggest cannabis that's got the finest THC content you'll ever see just by using the soil food web. I was hooked. and essentially anybody that runs into the soil food web, I think, becomes hooked as well, because it's a beautiful, elegant, natural system that's been going on since plants and fungus met each other and established themselves on land, and it's just one of these irrefutable, wonderful systems that anybody can learn, that nature uses, and it's just our entryway into all manner of terrific things. So that, in a nutshell, is what I talk about all the time. It's extremely important because soil is at the base of everything. We don't have soil, we don't have life. And our soil, particularly in this country, is going to shit. And if we don't start treating it properly, if we don't start making sure that the soil food web is established and living in it, we're going to be in big trouble. It goes beyond whether we eat organic or non-organic. It's our very presence in life. In the next 40 or 50 years, one of the 17 essential elements will reach peak phosphorus. We can reach peak phosphorus. That means after that, we will be at a point where we are not regenerating the phosphorus, we're losing phosphorus, and we're going to run out of phosphorus. Well, it turns out that the soil food web supports something called mycorrhizal fungi, which are famous for going out and getting phosphorus that's locked up in the soil so that you don't have to add it to your fertilizer mixes or to your hydroponic mixes, et cetera, et cetera. So if you want to understand genetically modified foods and why they're bad and why Roundup is a bad thing, you have to understand the soil food web. You have to understand how plants eat. You have to understand that when you put Roundup down, you're creating minerals, you're raking them all together and tying them all up and preventing them from getting in. So all of these things relate to this incredible soil food web process. So ended up writing these 3 books. It was a pleasure to do so, and I just have to thank Tom Alexander, because I would have been using Miracle-Gro, and I'll just quickly tell this story because I think I'm one of the only people in the world that's allowed to badmouth Miracle-Gro. Tom and I, as members of the Garden Writers of America, had the pleasure of meeting a guy named Horace Hagedorn, who was the founder of Miracle-Gro. He was about 4'8", roly-poly, wonderful guy. And he would come to the Garden Writers of America and give us money for scholarships and wonderful things. And this was back before many of us knew better. And Horace one day gave a talk about how he founded Miracle-Gro, and he explained that he got out of school from the University of Pennsylvania, same school Trump went to, and as an advertising executive, went to work for a butter company in New York, where he had to distinguish one butter from another butter, and all butter is exactly the same. It's all USDA grade A, blah, blah, blah. He hated the job. He wanted to kill himself, cut himself with a Gillette razor, which one of his classmates was getting to advertise, and run himself into a car, coming traffic. But instead, he would spend his weekends driving around trying to clear his head. And one weekend, he ran into the inventor of Miracle-Gro. They go into business just for fun. He makes $20,000 the first week of advertising the product with a before and after Miracle-Gro ad. And the rest is history. He ends up getting a call from Scott's that now makes the licenses the Monsanto Roundup, by the way, and owns General Hydroponics, by the way, none of which we should be using. He gets a call from Scott that they're going to buy him out, and he ends up reverse buying, and he flips over and buys them out for $365 million. Anyway, we're at the talk, and he gives us this talk, and afterwards we all go up to get little boxes of Miracle-Gro that he gave us signed. And so I'm standing there, and Tom's standing there, probably next to me, and Horace Hagedorn looks up and he says, "Uh-oh, are you a Lowenfels?" And I said, "Yes." And he said he apologized for telling the story about the butter company, because it turned out my father and grandfather owned the butter company that he went to work for, that he hated so much that he ended up going into the Miracle-Gro business. And we became great friends, and he would come up to Anchorage, Alaska, and film ads that you would see on the Super Bowl for Miracle-Gro. So very, very good friends. I think it was before the book came out. I think if the book had come out, he would have read it. I think he would have seen the light. I'm not sure he would have switched, but he would have done something different. It's unfortunate that he died before the book came out. But in any case, Tom Alexander is responsible for my breaking up my relationship with Miracle-Gro, and I can never thank Tom enough for that, because it not only changed my life, but frankly, as a result of being able to write the books, I think it's changed thousands and thousands of people's lives. And so, once again, Tom did a great, wonderful, pioneering thing. So thank you, Tom.
You're welcome.
Yeah. So anyway,
you were open-minded enough to consider.
Yeah, I'm glad I was too, because I'm normally not. But anyway, so the first book was, how food gets to the plant. It's this wonderful attraction that the plant sets up, et cetera, et cetera. So then one day I'm sitting, after the book comes out, it's doing well. I'm sitting in a restaurant, and I'm looking at a picture of a bunch of ladies eating spaghetti, and I'm saying to myself, I wonder how plants eat. How do they eat? I mean, you ever think about that? We feed our plants. We know there's 17 essential elements, and we feed them kelp and all this stuff. How do they eat it? How do they take it in? This is the essential question that man has been asking, and that has impacted the way we grow things forever. And so during the time of Thomas Jefferson and George Washington, they thought plants ate soil, literally ate soil, chewed it up. That's why we rototill. They pulverized up the soil, so that it would be able, the plants could eat it better. Well, so I asked, how do they eat? And it led to a 3-year, oh my God, I should have learned chemistry. What a big mistake, not listening to Dr. Tripp when I could have. So I had to teach myself chemistry and molecular biology, and it came up with the answer to how plants eat. And it's in that second book. It's a little bit thick. It does have some chemistry in it. I promised myself I wouldn't have the Krebs cycle or any of that kind of crap. Tried to write it in lay terms. And then after that book came out, it became very evident to me that something that I had revised the first book with, mycorrhizal fungi, had developed to the point where our knowledge of it had developed to the point where a separate book could be written on that, because they are really the ultimate fungi, the ultimate microbe in terms of getting food for plants that the plants can't get themselves. And so now I know a lot about how plants eat, and people send me microbes to test out all the time, and I'm always trying to figure out whether things work, whether they're good, whether they make any sense for plants, whether the things we do growing cannabis make sense. For example, we put down kelp. We put down kelp. A lot of hemp growers or cannabis growers use kelp. And they think, well, it's got 52 nutrients in it. That's why they use kelp. No, those 52 nutrients, only 17 of them are used. I mean, the rest of them are not needed. So we use kelp not to feed the plant. We use kelp to feed the microbes, which end up feeding the plant. And because you use kelp, which has 52 different nutrients in it, you end up with an unbelievably diverse microbial population, which is what you want to have. It's not the 52 nutrients that go into the plant, it's the 17 that go into the plant, but they're all there because of the gigantic diversity of microbes, et cetera, et cetera. So I could go on and on and on. All I do is think about this stuff all the time. My wife has gotten completely bored living with me. It's all plants and microbes, and occasionally a little bit of cannabis. And so that's my life, and I've bored you guys to tears, and I will stop now. And if you have any questions, go right ahead.
I'll start by saying thank you. It's really awesome to listen to you.
You can't hear anything.
When Tom told me you were joining us, I scoured YouTube looking for different presentations you've done, and I've been going through your books, and I find them incredibly enlightening. So,
well, thank you.
It's very cool to have you on. And so you really were kind of into the synthetic solutions for a long time. I mean, when I was a kid, we grew up that commercial from DuPont was better living through chemistry. Right. And you moved away from it.
Right. Well, I always, in fact, that's in one of my slideshows. I always show the picture of Mr. Wizard, the TV show, Better Living Through Chemistry. It was GE, I think. Maybe it was DuPont. I don't know. But, and he had this television show, and then he had that little dweeby assistant that worked with him. And I like to say that, she took the slogan Better Living with Chemistry and many in our generation very seriously. And so, we live better with chemistry, all sorts of drugs and everything else. But, yeah, I mean, you get hooked on the paradigm switch and you can't go back. The idea that chemicals made sense back in the 50s because we were pushed, the science was pushed on us. It was bad science, but we were inundated. I mean, there was no choice. Organics, I mean, God, you were a kooky nut. Today, look, you go into the supermarket, there's $10 billion worth of organic foods for sale. I mean, there are people who will eat nothing but organic. I try to be one of them. So, yeah, it's a whole big different life, isn't it? And the switch, when I made the switch, boy, I always told people, you convince me that I'm wrong at the Garden Writers Conference, I'll be the biggest proponent of organics you can possibly be. Here we are.
And this might be a great example of consumers leading the market because the growers were not really motivated to grow organically until there was a market that was demanding an organic product. So as people became more informed, then they started creating an economy around this need. So farmers are now meeting it. And I think it's a good thing. I've always believed there was a balance. I've grown hydroponically, I've grown organically. I kind of do a mix of them, if you will, depends on the products I'm using. But on a large scale, when you see people growing outdoors, I think there's no other way to do it than to do it organically and to make sure that you're being stewards of the land, and you have to be alert of what you're putting back into the earth.
Yeah. No question. No question. And even indoors, if you can. I mean, not easy.
No, in some situations indoors, though, you're using things like Hydroton and, Grodan, and it's a different situation.
Some people are setting up aerated compost tea brewers right in the hydroponic tank and brewing constantly compost teas. And you got to have good filtration system because the emitters and irrigation delivery gets clogged. But there's been a lot of successful. You got to aerate it. You can't just let it ferment.
Right. Yeah, and you got to be very cleanly. I mean, but you got to be cleanly anyway. So it's, I mean, the problem with the indoor is really that it's not soil. I'm a big soil proponent. Obviously, I think cannabis grown in soil tastes better. Maybe that's just my prejudice, but
no, I think it's scientifically proven that you get better expressions of terpenes in soil, and you get sometimes better expressions of cannabinoids in synthetic, Grodan hydroponic style growing.
Now that doesn't mean you can't use some of the organic inputs into the in the hydroponic system. So, for example, mycorrhizal fungi will establish itself in a hydroponic chemical system, and as long as your numbers are below 10, you get phosphorus numbers are down even lower, maybe 5 parts per million, you end up with establishing a mycorrhizal fungi system that'll go out and get nutrients for your plants. So it is possible to do it. I don't use the hydroponic chemicals. I always use the compost tea system. The thing I find is that you've got to make sure you keep the slime, bacterial slime. The bacteria form these colonies and they get a slimy, sticky coating on them, and they'll coat areas of your system, and you got to keep that clean. Otherwise, you end up with bad guys getting into your hydroponic system. Interesting, the whole hydroponic question these days because of the Miracle-Gro Scott's general hydroponics, sort of thing going on here. It's fascinating to watch the hydroponic industry and how it's changed from a point where people were convinced that they shouldn't be using advanced neutronics, to maybe they're not so bad, and general hydroponics, which people were using, maybe is bad. It's fast. I find the whole hydroponic industry going through some big changes, and the customer use of it going through some big changes.
So you're telling me if your family had a more hospitable butter factory, we wouldn't have Miracle-Gro.
Yeah, or if butter was a little bit different, you know, that was the problem. I mean, he just hated it. And I went to work for my father as well. And I got to tell you, I lasted 6 months. He lasted, I think Horace lasted about a year. It's it's all the same. And after a while, it all smells the same. It looks the same. And oh God. Anyway, that's a whole nother question. But again, you know, had it been a different time, Horace might have developed cannabis butter or something of that sort. He was quite a guy. It was really, really quite a lot of fun. But what's happened to the company these days? I mean, I'm upset about it. I'm upset that they license Roundup. I'm upset that Scott's Miracle-Gro has purchased Whitney Farm, and that first of organic soil companies, you know, now has a bag full of moss. Moss is collected from the wild. It doesn't, you know, they don't grow it. They collect it from the wild. It's worse than collecting peat moss, you know, and here it is in Whitney Farm's bag because Miracle-Gro sticks it in there. They now own the label. It sort of upsets me, but things are changing. I mean, I think people are becoming pretty conscious and starting to talk about this stuff. You go into a hydro store now, you see signs, you know, next to some of these products saying, you know, this is not the one you want to buy because, or boycott, etc. So I think, you know, we're having a little bit of an impact anyway, but I got off course here.
I always hate to be the one that jumps in. Go ahead, Mel.
Well, I know that I used Miracle-Gro back in the 70s. In fact, one of the earliest photos I have of me in the garden is a box of Miracle-Gro sitting up there on a shelf.
Sure.
You know, I started off kind of organically. I mean, I really didn't know about that then, but I would end up fertilizing with something like Miracle-Gro or Rapid Grow if the plants needed nitrogen. Particularly nitrogen was the main one that they would be missing. But I mean, at this point, I grow strictly organically outdoors for consumption. I do use, I think it comes from Wow, Wow, the pumpkin people.
That's where this leaf came from. This is a Wow leaf.
Okay, there you go.
That's why we all said wow.
A gallon bucket out there and use that. The only thing that concerns me is that I'm using the tap water. And I think that LA has gone away from chlorine, and they're using is it chloramine? You know that? Yeah. Is it chloramine now?
Chloramine, yeah.
Yeah, and even the chlorine itself, I had always been under the impression that it evaporated, and so I would leave a bucket full and wouldn't use it for a couple days, let that chlorine go off. But from what I understand, it doesn't really evaporate without the help of the sun. And now with the chloramine, I don't think it ever gets out of there. I don't really know.
Right.
But in any event, I still use it to make the tea, and the plants certainly seem to grow just fine. I do agree that from my experience, you get the tastiest plants when you grow organically. I mean, what I've grown outdoors and what I grow indoors is quite a bit of difference. And what I grow indoors is strictly for seed, so I'm not really growing for consumption. But of course, I keep some bud sensimilla so I can taste them and see what's going on.
Sure,
and
sure.
Definitely the organic grows outdoors are really the way to go for me.
Yeah, well, the chloramine is in most tap water now has both chlorine and chloramine. The chlorine will evaporate out, and in fact, if you spray your lawn or your plants with a spray, that's enough to get rid of the chlorine. The chloramine, on the other hand, does not evaporate out. But it's complexed out by organics like humic acids or the glomus that's given out by mycorrhizal fungi and deposited in soil, and so it very quickly becomes complexed up and tied up. So that's why it doesn't kill all of the microbes. It gets tied up by the organics. The terpenes is an interesting question. We were discussing this a little bit yesterday as we were testing the cameras and stuff. There are some very, very interesting articles. We all know that plants communicate with each other by sending out terpene signals. It turns out that sort of bacteria and fungi, and not only to their intra-species, but to their interspecies, so to each other. Fungi to bacteria, bacteria to different kinds of bacteria, express themselves and communicate, for the most part, with terpenes. Well, gee, now you sit back and you think, so I'm growing my cannabis in soil where there are tremendous numbers of bacteria and fungi. They're getting into the simplest and the apoplist systems. They're getting into the cell walls of the plants and everything else. And they've got terpenes communicating. Yeah, makes sense that it tastes better from a microbial point.
Evolution doesn't waste much of anything, and if something is given off, somebody's going to find a use for it.
Isn't that the truth?
That way.
Isn't that the truth? Isn't that the truth?
Well, can you give us a little history of synthetic nutrients, Jeff?
Well, synthetic nutrients, yeah, it's a great story, and included in the second book, Teeming with Nutrients. There was I think it was Joseph Banks. He was head of the Royal Science Society in England, and he gave a speech challenging the scientists of the world to find a source of nitrogen because they were running out of nitrogen worldwide. Germany, which was landlocked, developed its navy because it was necessary to have a navy to support and defend nitrogen islands where they got guano from. And so that's why a landlocked country like Germany, which had tremendous agriculture, was running out of nitrogen, had developed the Bismarck and all that kind of stuff. It was not to fight a war, it was because they needed to protect their guano islands. And so anyway, the challenge was out, and that eventually led to the Germans developing artificial nitrogen fixation. Nobody thought twice about using it as a fertilizer until after World War II, when they started to notice that some of these areas, that had been bombed, were green. Nitrogen, of course, made sense, and so they converted these factories into making fertilizer. And along comes television, color television. And people like Tom Alexander's father and my father and your mother's were watching the U.S. Open in 1954 on the color television set, and they saw this unbelievable green fairway, and they went, "Whoo, look at that, no weeds." And it's green as can be. How'd that get that way? And boom, lawn fertilizers went crazy. They dropped the nitrogen fixing clover from it so that they could continue to use 2,4-D. And boom, 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 the lawn industry went crazy as a result of color television and golf. And the next thing you know, here we are, fighting off an industry that is so embedded in our country, that they get to make laws, they get to put their people in power, and their corporations get to pay for elections. It was unfreaking believable. All as a result of
polluting the planet. And
oh yeah, that goes without saying, And we were running out of nitrogen. I mean, there was no question we needed to develop it. It's an unbelievable story, but crazy, absolutely crazy.
Thank you for that. It's funny because I was inspired to really get into. I started in soil, as most all of us do. My grandmother taught me how to grow a garden in the backyard, and somebody traded me a bag of pot for a Mel Frank book back in 1984, and I realized that all I needed was my grandmother's fluorescent lights, her timer, her pots, her soil. She had a watering can. All I needed to do was go buy some fertilizer, and I went out and got Peter's 20-20-20, which was available at the local CVS at the time. And I was only 13, and I went in the store just like I was buying porn. It felt like or something, because when I got it, I felt like they had to have known I was going to use it to grow cannabis. And I went up to the thing, and I was trying to clarify to the guy that I was getting it from my grandma. And, I took it home, and it worked. And, so I was using kind of that system, and then started reading Sensimilia tips and moved into hydroponics and ebb and flow. And now I've gone back to soil, and I still do drip irrigation. But it's funny that I felt that the taste and the flavor that I got out of soil plants even though I didn't get the same yield that I got using hydroponics, was worth it.
It's easier too. It's much easier.
Well, it's somewhat similar when you're dripping. So, you know, although the soil gives you a little boost, if you're using it if you're using it with an organic mixture of a rich soil to start off, you can feed it at a very low rate and have great results.
Absolutely. And if you use the right soil, you don't even have to feed it. I mean, that's here in Alaska, we've got some soil that is just beyond belief. It's called Alaska Humus, and I mean, you can stick your finger in it, it'll grow, and we don't feed our plants at all, basically. I mean, the mycorrhizal fungi, we use the WOW, which incidentally, Ron Wallace, who makes the product WOW, are we allowed to talk about products on your show? Is that all right?
You can talk about anything you want.
Well, one day, very early on after Teaming with Microbes came out, I was giving a talk in upstate New York, and a big guy comes in wearing an orange jacket, you know, an orange sports jacket, big guy, stands in the back, standing room only, only talk I've ever had, standing room only. And this guy just stood there with his arms crossed, scowling the whole time. People were asking questions at the end of the talk. And finally he raises his hand and he says, I just have one thing to say. And I go, oh, this is it. This guy's going to just tear me apart. It turns out it's Ron Wallace. And he goes, I grew 2 world record pumpkins. I added 600 blah, blah, blah pounds by reading this guy's book. You know, I went, holy crow, that was a nice thing for the guy to say. He invites me to come and speak to the giant pumpkin people. Nice guy, you know, flash forward 15 years. He sends me a packet of WOW. Now, you know, I know the mycorrhizal fungi that's in it is the one that pairs with cannabis, but he's got other stuff in there as well. He's got some carbon materials, et cetera, et cetera. So you know, knowing Ron, I tried it on my tomatoes and on my cannabis plant. Well, you saw the cannabis plant. Holy crow. Unfrickin' believable. Wow is the word. I can't say enough about this stuff. I mean, he just nailed it to the T. Now, he works with a guy in California that's been producing mycorrhizal fungi for a long time. They've got it nailed down. And for years, people were buying 5 and 6 different kinds of fungi mix. You only need the one that's in that product. And it works. It works like nothing I've ever seen. And it'll work on a lot of different vegetables as well, because it happens to be one of the mycorrhizal fungi that pairs up with potatoes, carrots, peas, lots of other things as well. So use it in your vegetable garden as well as in your cannabis. But wow, mycorrhizal.
Well, you know, how do we as growers create this wonderful ideal soil? Where do we get it? Where do we start? I mean, please.
Yeah, good question. Yeah,
guide
really
us.
Well, obviously, the first place to start is with compost, for a number of reasons. I'm a big believer that to the extent that you possibly can, the majority of your microbes, you want to have local microbes. You know, things that have been in your ecosystem, keeping that ecosystem free of various things, et cetera, et cetera. You want to have, basically, if you can, mostly local microbes. You make compost. Certainly you can add stuff to the compost that's going to add different microbes as well. And you can add, you know, the WOW, you bring it in, et cetera, et cetera. But you want to start with compost. The best compost you can possibly make or buy. Frankly, if you can do vermicompost to start, that's for my way of thinking, the best way to go, because the worms concentrate the nutrients, or several of the nutrients that are in the stuff that goes through them. All the worms really want are a couple of the bacteria and protozoa. They don't give a damn about the leaf or the soil particle. They just want the microbes that are in the stuff, and so they concentrate the nutrients that are in the stuff that they poop out. And vermicompost has got, you know, 7 times more nitrogen and more phosphorus, blah blah blah, you know, than regular compost has. So you want to try to get that. You have to add mycorrhizal fungi to it. You have to add a little bit of clay to your soils, because clay holds nutrients like crazy. Again, explained in the second book, I think in pretty simple terms. You want to test it. Now, testing it has meant 2 things. The first test is you want to test it for its nutrient value. You don't have to test compost for its nutrient value every single time, but you need to know the first couple of times that you make compost that you're making good compost. Once you figure it out, it's like making coffee. You know how to make coffee. You don't have to have it. You don't have to taste test it every time you make it. It's 5 scoops and you get good coffee. So, but you got to test it the first couple of times. The testing for nutrients should be done in an organic testing lab. It can cost $50. It's worth every penny of it. You want to make sure what you're using is good and makes a lot of sense. I don't use manures in my compost because I don't want to fool around with E. coli. You can use manures, but you got to be very, very careful. You got to make sure what you know is in the manure. For example, if it contains tetracycline and you don't compost it properly, that tetracycline is going to end up on the leaves of your cannabis plant that you're growing in it. So you got to be very careful. If you use manures, you just got to make sure you're turning your pile enough that it really is fully composted, etc. Mycorrhizal fungi has to be added at the end of the process. There are a couple of ways of adding mycorrhizal fungi depending on what you're growing. If you're growing cannabis, you can just simply use the wow. If you're doing a big landscaping job or something of that sort, you can plant plants in your compost to grow the mycorrhizal spores. Rudbeckia, of all things, happens to be the best plant to use, apparently. It grows and attracts several different kinds of mycorrhizal fungi, so that's kind of a good way to go. And you got to make sure that your compost, when you finish it, drains well. So if you've got to add sand or perlite or coir, then you got to do that at the end of the process after you make it. I always like to try to grow something quick in my compost to make sure that it's good. So I use cilantro, which will put out a crop in about 7 days. And finally, recently, I started working with a testing system which a woman has developed called a microbiometer. And if you go to www.microbiometer.com, MICROBE biometer.com, you'll come to the site that talks about this thing. It's a brand new invention. This woman is a 76-year-old microbiologist who has figured out a way of first separating out your soil, your microbes from a soil sample. And so she's developed a test whereby for about $10 in the field in about 10 minutes, you can separate out the microbes that are in your soil like you would during compost tea making. Instead of making it 24-hour period, it's a little 10-minute period. And you then take 3 or 4 drops of the material, whether it's compost or compost tea or soil, and you put it on this little card, which she's got some very specialized membrane she invented, and then you take a picture of it with your cell phone, and it instantly tells you the microbial biomass. Now, what's microbial biomass? It's the percentage of your soil that's got microbes in it. So you've got inorganics, you've got plant material, and you've got microbial biomass. The microbial biomass is an indication of the microbes that are in your soil. If you've got a lot of microbes, then you've got soil where the organics are being decayed and broken down and converted, held in the bodies of the microbes, and available for plants. So if you have a high microbial biomass, you do not need to fertilize your plants at all. If you have a low microbial biomass, you know you have to increase it. And because you can do this test in the field, you can do it on a daily basis or a weekly basis, and you can determine what's going on with your plants given the inputs that you're giving them. So if you want to grow cannabis, you want to watch very carefully the microbial biomass. It begins to drop as soon as the plant starts to flower. The biomass right around the root system. It's fascinating. So I've been using this system, and it's sort of citizen science. I'm trying to get as many people as I can to get one of these kits. You get about 10 or 12 tests for about $100, so that you can test your materials and know what's going on. You can tell when your compost tea is finished. You can tell when your compost has reached its maximum microbial biomass. You can tell whether the soil that you're buying from somebody is any good, or whether you've got 3 or 4 different choices of soil, which one's the best. This cost hundreds of dollars before. You had to do a DNA testing. And lately, the tests that are being done by a couple of universities have shown that microbial biomass correlates to nitrogen and carbon content. So if you have a high microbial biomass, you have a high nitrogen carbon content, which makes sense because they're holding the carbon and nitrogen in their bodies. So I test my stuff in many different ways, and once I know it works, bingo, I use it and I reuse it all the time. I think one of the biggest mistakes people make is they make compost, they grow maybe a cannabis crop, and then they throw their stuff away. Reuse that soil. It's crazy. People develop this wonderful soil. They grow a plant in that soil that attracts the right microbes into that soil with its exudates, and then we throw it away at the end of the. That's crazy, absolutely crazy. So that's my soil system. Way more than you wanted to hear.
Jeff, last week we were talking about cannabis roots potential medicinal value. You think the roots have a plant nutrient value for future crops?
Oh, absolutely. When I harvest my crops, I cut the plant at the base of the soil and I leave that root system in right there, and I plant right back in the same system. There is no question that those roots have mycorrhizal spores, which are valuable to any new plant that you put in there. B, mycorrhizal fungi, which have grown out into the system and which now are dead, are releasing the glomalin that's in their bodies. That's where the carbon comes from in our soil. So, and then of course you've got the root material itself, which is organic and which is used as a microbe food, some of which is sort of like, licking the sugar off a donut. It's still got some exudates on it, and so it's a great food source. So yeah, I definitely use that stuff, no question. I'm a big proponent in taking my dead leaves, because I don't make oils. When I trim my plants, I take my dead leaves, I put them back right there on the soil for the plant. What falls down from a plant's supposed to fall down. That's how plants feed themselves. And so this is all part of regenerative gardening. Yes, is the answer.
Well, can I ask you something? How do organic farmers that are dealing with that deal with, let's say, pests? Like if they're dealing with things like thrips or fungus gnats or root-borne pathogens, how can you fix that and then reuse the soil?
Well, there are any number of, first of all, biological methods which they can try. So nematodes, in fact, Dr. Elaine on the Compost Tea listserv just noted that, she's now selling some beneficial nematodes, which sounded to me like they'd be pretty useful for growers. There are all sorts of biologicals that have been designed and developed, which we know about, and of course there are all these wonderful insects and things that you can buy that are in the catalogs and stuff that work quite well. Neem oil, Azamex can be applied. Compost teas themselves, and of course if you use any of these things and you feel uncomfortable about potential after impacts like Azamex, for example, then you go back and you inundate the area with a good compost tea to bring it back. Sometimes you don't succeed, but you got to admit that.
Well, can I ask you then a question? Because for a long time, and a couple of shows ago, I brought this up because I felt that the thought in hydroponic gardening is that you have to flush your plants at the end of their flowering cycle to devoid them of these nutrients supposedly that built up in the plant. And I have been someone that grew organically and grown in Northern California in the soil in greenhouses and done it a lot of different ways. And I would love you to talk about how plants, if they do hold on to nutrients, and if that applies to growing in an organic situation like you are, because there's no way to flush this. You're not going to want to devoid the medium of nutrients when you're going to reuse it. So is there an accumulation, I guess, is my question, of nutrients in the plants? And the other question I have, I guess it's a two-part, is when people are growing specifically for fragrances, essential oils, how do they deal with feeding their plants at the end of their flowering cycle when a majority of these oils are building up?
Yeah, you know, so let's start with the second question first. There was an article that just came out last week. They're beginning to determine that specific nutrients, particularly the metal nutrients in the rhizosphere, may be what gives rise to a stronger terpene presence of one kind or another. And unfortunately, I don't have access to the article right now, and like an idiot, I was probably a little bit high and didn't pump it in, so I'll have to go find that one. But so they're beginning to think that yeah, you can very specifically alter the terpene content by changing the metal content in the rhizosphere, and it was very, very interesting. And again, it was manganese and magnesium, and it was fascinating. So people are obviously going to be starting that. Again, before I mentioned the bacteria is going to be a very helpful thing, because there's no question the bacteria and the fungi contain terpene signaling abilities that get in the plant. To go to the beginning part of the question about flushing plants, it's a conundrum to me, and I'm not sure I really believe in flushing. Now that may sound like heresy. I'm not a big organic guy. I mean, I'm not a big hydroponic guy. I am not a real scientist. I'm a fake scientist. You know, I research stuff. I read. I'm an amateur scientist, just like, you know, well, you guys aren't. You guys are real, but I read and teach myself. So am I a real scientist? I don't know. But I try to think like a scientist. And so when I think about my second book, which again, you know, when people picked up the first book, they went, wow, this is a great book. This really is easy to read. This makes the science simple. They picked up the second book, they went, ooh, gee, this is a little bit more thick. This is a little harder to read. What they don't get is just read it, because when you finish it, you get it. And one of the things you get is that there's this dual system that all plants have, cellular system. If I can back up just for a second, what goes on inside a plant cell, let's just talk about one cell, is so frickin' amazing. It is so mind-boggling that I try not to think about it, because if I do, I just get lost in this incredible metaphysical world of craziness. I don't have to get stoned to get there. You know, I mean, it's just nutty. In a single plant cell, inside that plant cell, there are 10,000 10,000 different enzymes. That's the number. 10,000 different enzymes. And there are at least 1,000 of each one of those 10,000 enzymes. Okay. So you've got these very complex proteins that look like, you know, broken down jungle gyms, you know, that are inside this cell. You got so many of these, and then you've got mitochondria and chloroplasts and all these other things in there, and they're all inside this cell. They don't go out of that cell. They don't flow out of that cell. They're stuck in that cell by the cell membrane. Now, why would a nutrient that's inside that cell get flushed out when all that other stuff doesn't get flushed out? Okay. Now, they can move in and out, but it didn't, you know, I mean, it's not that easy. There is a special pore in these membranes. These are called aquaporines, and water flows through these aquaporines, one molecule at a time, lined up one after another. It's fascinating. But that's not enough, you know, to really, it's too small an area to flush out these big nutrients, etc. It doesn't make any sense in that regard. The second thing is there is a dual system inside the plant. So all of these cells are connected to each other, and they form a system known as the symplast. And if you were to enter through a cell membrane into one of these cells, you could canoe around from that cell to another cell to another cell to another cell, all the way throughout the plant. They're all connected. It's sort of like a beehive. You know, it's not really a living organism until you take the whole thing. Same thing with these plants. All these things, super annonated individual cells that are all connected to each other. But to get into that is very, very hard, very difficult. You have to go through the root system, through a cuticle to get into it. The cell walls themselves are all connected. So if you entered into a cell wall in the root, you could climb your way through the cellulose in that cell wall into the next cell, into the next cell wall, into the next cell wall. You can't get into the cell, but you can stay in that cell wall. Now, when you flush, you may be washing out the stuff that's in the cell walls, but I really don't think you're washing out the stuff that's in the cell. So that's sort of my thought on flushing.
Well, can I join you? I completely join you in your hearsay, because I've always believed that people don't understand the concept of what they're doing in the first place, and I you know, my idea is that plants build up sugars through photosynthesis that it uses as energy, and that really is a disconnect from the nutrients and the salts that are in their base anyway. And when you look at it, like, I understand that in tomato growing that there is a technique where they do leach the plants at the end of their cycle, and it burns up some of the excess sugars, and for whatever reason makes the fruit sweeter to our taste. But you know, that's not how we use cannabis. And when
and that's not flushing either, really. I mean, it's a different way of doing it, I think.
Well, you know, at the end of a fruit's life cycle, like tomatoes, it's, you know, it's just something that is part of trying to enhance the flavor of the fruit. But when you're growing something like cannabis and you're trying to build up essential fragrances, you know, terpenes, it to me doesn't make sense to pull all of the nutrients out at the end. Like, I definitely think that things like nitrogen are not needed at the end of a flowering cycle, and throughout most of the flowering cycle, to be straight up. But understanding what nutrients our plants need when they need them, I think, is much more substantial than a lot of what the labels say, which is, you know, XYZ week number 7, you know, flush with pH water, and it's just stupid. And then I think that a lot of times now that we're getting into these unique varieties of cannabis that take 10, 11, 12 weeks to finish flowering, now at what point would you really want to cut off feeding to a plant like that when it's got to be sustained for, let's say, a third longer, a 12-week flowering plant than an 8-week flowering plant? So learning how to actually feed our plants, I think, is an essential part of this. And, you know, for people that want to get their soil tested, where could somebody go in their local city or something and get a soil test done?
Well, best place is the university is the best local place, and they almost all of them have particularly a land grant university has a cooperative extension service, and they're all actually beginning to do organic testing, which is good. Of course, you can also test it at Soil Food Web for the microbial stuff. This microbiometer, I think it's going to be the test. I think it's going to get adopted by the USDA. And I think it is the test. I am dumbfounded at what I'm able to do with it. It's just, now, you know, they're sending me free tests so I can use it. I'm not paying the $110, but they're going to start making me, and it's going to be worth every penny of it. But then to go back to what we're doing with the flower, I mean, we're really, in comparing it to a tomato, that flower ultimately wants to develop seeds. We don't want it to develop seeds. I mean, of course, now we have Sensimilla, but the stuff that it's got in it, we want in it. We don't want it to go down to I don't want the sugars and the starches to go down into the root system. That's what makes the flower unique. That's what makes it, you know, what it is. You know, we're not worried about acid like they are with a tomato, you know, which can taste different depending on the acidic content, et cetera, et cetera. We want to have the most stuff in it that we possibly can. So again, I think you're right. I think people really need to understand the process. They need to understand how a plant works. It's the most amazing thing, and it has so many implications in a much broader sense. And again, I get very metaphysical about it. I mean, it's when you think about what goes inside a plant, inside a plant cell, the same thing goes inside our earth, us. I mean, we're a bunch of we're enzymes now interacting with each other, just like the enzymes interact inside a plant. And we're building ideas inside a plant. They're building, a nutrient that becomes a starch, etc. It's an unbelievable, beautiful, beautiful system, and we don't study it properly in school. When you studied in high school, you studied a flat piece of paper. This is a beautiful three-dimensional machine of the most intricate design. It makes you begin to think, how did it get there? Who made it? How did it develop? Now, in my instance, the way my mind works, it dawned on me, this beautiful thing called chemistry, which creates these physical molecules. These things automatically do stuff. I mean, chemistry is life. Chemistry is God. I mean, it's just fascinating to me. Anyway, you get into this stuff, but if you don't get into this stuff, you're not thinking about how your plant grows. And if you're not thinking about how your plant grows, then you're not a good grower. Because if you're not understanding what's going on inside that cell at any given time, then what are you doing? And most of us are not good growers because we don't know. We have to teach ourselves. We didn't learn in school. There was no reason to teach us in school. As I say, in school, we had microscopes and we looked at paramecium. We looked at paramecium instead of bacteria because paramecium we could see. We could see the gullet and the cilia and all that kind of stuff. The bacteria, they were too small. But they never told us why would you care about a paramecium? Well, a paramecium will eat 10,000 bacterium a day. That means if you have a paramecium in your soil, it's pooping out the benefits of 10,000 bacteria into your plant system. Well, if you know that that straw is coated with paramecium, you can make a paramecium tea, and then you can put that down on your plants, and you get gazillions of paramecium eating 10,000 bacterium a day, and you feed your plant by using paramecium. I wish they told me that in high school. I would have saved myself buying a lot of Miracle-Gro over the years. So it's not just that kind of stuff. It's knowing what's in your soil. It's testing your soil. If you don't test your soil, how can you possibly know what your plant needs? How can you possibly know if you don't test the tissue in your hydroponic plant whether you're giving it the right stuff or whether it needs more stuff? Information is power. We all know that. And yet, how many people test their soil?
Well, a lot of us didn't realize it was an option. I mean, 20 years ago, I used to get soil that, used to say greenhouse safe, and then it was supposedly clean of bugs. And now you get stuff that's, whipped up in Northern California. The part of the problem I've seen soil go down in the last 20, 25 years that I've been buying it in California, because it seems like as Proposition 215 passed in 1996 and more people started growing, the demand for organic soils went through the roof, and there was no way that they were able to, take the care or compost as long or have as much time with the product as they did under the new demand. Maybe I'm crazy, but I think it's a real problem that we have now that so many people are growing cannabis and so many people are buying soil. It's different now than it was 20 years ago.
And I think you're right, and that's one of the reasons why people shouldn't be throwing it away. I mean, at the very minimum, put it into a compost pile and use it again. But you're absolutely right. The quality of compost is going way down. People who make good compost are making a fortune. I mean, on the East Coast, there's a company called Pogo. Oh my gosh, they make beautiful, beautiful compost.
Hey, you know what, Jeff? For some reason, your microphone got a little staticky on us, and I'm not sure why.
Is that better? Or is it? I don't know.
No, Tom, how does it sound to you?
Yeah, it's staticky.
Static. Oh. Let's see.
Very staticky.
Try turning it on.
Is it better?
Mm-mm.
Let me go up to my control system here.
Well, let me just say a couple things while I was figuring that out. Is that when I started, I would buy topsoil, which you could get on the East Coast. And, it was clean, but that was the base that I would start with. The other thing about the testing is that I had a field test kit which I could test for NPK and I think magnesium. I really don't remember all of the aspects of it, but I had no money at the time, so it couldn't have been that expensive. But it came in like a toolbox form, and it would give you the basis of what's going on, your pH and that. And that's what I use. So I mean, I don't think people have to go to a university to have tests. Of course, that's the easiest way. But if you're testing all the time, you can buy these kits. And I'm sure now, 40 years later, they're much better than what I was using back then.
Well, I think they are. I think they are better. Is my sound better? Did that come in better? No.
The other thing about the soil, buying the soil, is I think the problem with most of them is that they're completely manufactured. It's just wood and you know, various cellular stuff that they grind up and put out, and it's not real soil. I don't know what kind of bacteria.
You know what you might be able to do, Jeff, for your microphone is just reset your computer and follow the link that you originally came in on, and it should clear it up for you because you were super clear the first part of the show.
Just go back in again, huh?
Yeah, sir. Just reset your computer and come right back into the call. It should be okay. Yeah. Go ahead. Didn't mean to interrupt you, Mel.
Oh, just adding one thing to the conversation. You know, about using compost. The main thing is to make sure that the compost is not hot anymore. I mean, if you use hot compost, then you've got real trouble for the plant ever picking up the nutrients that it needs. You know, I have that trouble with one hole that had a lot of compost in it before I found out the compost was too hot. But I went ahead and used it anyway, and I'm suffering the consequences on that one hole.
The other thing that I found was when I was making compost, really large amounts of it, was you had to make sure that the carbon ratio was correct, and that you because if you leave too much carbon in it, it actually acts as a nitrogen suck rather than as a source of nitrogen.
I'm back. Is that better?
No, you might have to restart your whole computer, Jeff. For some whatever reason, you're getting a real breakup sound.
Let's try this.
No sound at all.
But no static.
But no static. Well, there's always the bright side. Nope, still no sound, Jeff. Yeah, you might just have to reset your whole computer and just start back up from fresh boot. No? Well, this is what happens when you go live. It's been fantastic, though. I think that a lot of people that are trying to grow substantially really have to look into this in all honesty and start really realizing the way that they're leaving the mediums that they're reusing and how they should be looking at reusing them.
I want to know that leap he has. Is that a result of photo period, soil, variety, or well, what?
He a few years ago came to the conclusion that, you know, the big giant vegetables in Alaska wasn't because of the long days that they have up there. It's because of the Alaska humus that is everywhere up there. And so I think it's more the additives that he's putting in.
Well,
and the soil that he's using, the Alaska humus soil. You know, in some places it's 12 feet deep. You know, he had a business where they were to build new buildings. They scooped it up and were shipping it down here and by the barge full. And for a time, General Hydroponics was using it in a soil mix that they were using. But I don't think they do business with each other anymore.
Well, the mediums that we use are really the roots of what we're doing. And there's a lot of ways to grow cannabis, but I think that growing organically, especially when you're trying to do it yourself or in the backyard, is kind of the easiest and most logical way to start.
And one of the things, this was about 5 or 6 years ago up in Washington, this compost soil company was using lawn clippings and the lawn clippings had heavy, it wasn't Roundup, it was some other herbicide, and the herbicide was coming through, and they had to recall like huge quantities of it because it was in the soil mix. And
that happens with a lot of city and county compost that is made by them, and that they sell it retail and wholesale, and it's just not 100% safe to use.
Sam, how have you grown most of the time? Soil?
Yeah, I grow in the soil, period. I mean, I've grown in containers a little bit, but in the earth is really the secret. Give a little bit more to your soil than you're going to take. So, you know, your soil is never exhausted. It's never played out. It's, you know, it's a sustainable farming.
Jeff was talking about the elaborate network that he saw in the cells with electron microscope. If you compare the Hubble telescope of the galaxies and stuff to the electron microscope, they are almost identical. The two shapes and networks and colors and everything. It's really amazing what he was talking about before, that it's a metaphysical experience.
Jeff, are you with us?
Yeah, I am. I'm trying to get this thing to work.
Oh, it works.
Fantastic.
Let's see. How's that?
The static is gone.
The static is gone.
Oh.
Hey, some of the people that have been watching emailed in some questions that are really good. If you don't mind me shooting them to you.
Sure.
Okay.
Yep.
Well, let's. I'm gonna just. I'm not. Well, this guy asked a question. We kind of went over how to remove or flush micros from soil lists during the end of flowering. I think we just spoke about that, so we'll move on from that one. This one asks, what is the best microbial product on the market for cannabis?
Wow. I think that wow is probably one of the best ones out there, frankly. And I hope everybody buys it. The guy is such a nice guy. He's doing this all by himself. And we all need to help him. It's called Wow Mycorrhizal. And you go to, I think it's Ron Wallace, just Ron Wallace Mycorrhizal and Google, and you'll get it.
And do you think it'll make the buds bigger too?
You know, that's what I'm waiting for. I used it on the autoflower plant, which I wanted to bring in, but it was just raining out too hard in my outside greenhouse. I didn't want to bring it in. But you know, the tomatoes on the control plants that I tried on tomatoes, they are bigger. Not gigantic. I wouldn't say they're, you know, Alaska State Fair prize big, but they're bigger than the controls. So I suspect that they will be bigger. Yeah.
So this is another one. Aside from what you just said about the biofilm issue, what tips do you have for those of us making aerated compost teas?
Well, I think it's obviously very, very important that the aeration level be kept high. That's the biggest problem, is people don't give enough aeration. And I think people don't experiment enough with their compost. They experiment too much with their nutrients that they put in. When you make compost tea, you really don't need to put in very many nutrients. It used to be that we just loaded it up with molasses because we thought, oh gosh, we'll get a lot of bacteria, or we loaded it up with fish hydrolyzed because we wanted to get more fungi. You know, what's in the compost is in the compost. The bacteria will definitely multiply, but you don't really need to feed them very much. If you feed them too much, they eat up all the oxygen, and so then they eat up all the fungi as well. And so, you know, don't put so many inputs into your compost tea. That'd be my first suggestion. And the second thing is, people ought to start thinking about making compost extracts, where you take a cheesecloth, you put compost in the cheesecloth, you put it into a bucket, and you just squeeze it. You know, you knead it like it's a pizza dough for 5 or 10 or 15 minutes, and you use that. It's not quite the same as compost tea. It doesn't have, the multiplication of the stuff, but it strips out enough of the microbes to make it very, very useful. Yeah, compost tea is terrific. There's just, and now there's more and more product available. Compost tea in a can, where they put some of the microbes to sleep and then you wake them up. Dr. Elaine has a couple of products. You know, it was becoming very, very popular, and it should. It's great stuff.
And tell them, share your secret on using oatmeal and yogurt for boosting fungi.
Yeah. So at the beginning of the show, we talked a little bit about the fact that your soil can be dominated by fungus or dominated by bacteria. And it depends, your plants, each one produces a different kind of nitrogen. And your plants like one kind of nitrogen versus another kind of nitrogen. And so with regard to cannabis, they happen to like soils that are bacterially dominated. And the bacterially dominated soil, that's great, but you got to have about 5% fungus, fungal content in the soil. And so you can increase the fungal content of your soil, or even make a fungal dominated soil by using baby compost. You take a handful of baby oatmeal, literally baby oatmeal, the kind of Gerber. You take it. You take a handful of it, you mix it in with a handful of compost, you put it into a nice dark area, and then in about 48 hours, you get a sponge of fungal hyphae. They grow, they multiply, they form the mycelium, and they tie together all of that compost. When you use that brick to make compost tea, you get a lot of fungi in your compost tea. So that's just a good little trick to make compost tea. Compost is really the key to everything as far as I'm concerned. But you're absolutely right. Before I got cut off, we are seeing a degradation in compost. There's more and more places that are just taking bark, you know, and charring it out. It's just not really good compost. There's even compost that just doesn't smell good. That's not compost. That's putrefying matter. It's gotten to the point where we're even able to sell compost from Alaska down into the lower 48 states. As expensive as the shipping is, it's good enough compared to the compost that's available in a lot of places in the lower 48 states like Las Vegas for people to pay the extra money to have it shipped down there. So it makes sense to find a good supply of compost. It makes even better sense to make your own compost. It's so easy to do. And it makes even more sense to use vermicompost. So if you get worms that can turn your material into compost, that's the best way to go, without question. Buying compost is always the last resort. And again, that's why I like this microbiometer test. You know, you can test it and tell you whether the stuff is any good. And I have tested some of the commercial stuff. I went down last week to Lowe's, and I bought a very famous brand of compost, which is made in the West Coast in Washington State, and it did not do well on the microbiometer test. It failed, frankly. I wouldn't buy it. So yeah, you got to pay attention. It is not the old days by any means.
That is incredible. Their other question was, what is the role of lactobacillus in this living soil approach to growing cannabis?
Sure. Of course, that's you know, that's what's in yogurt. It's also one of the 13 or 12 or 13 microbes that's in EM, effective microorganisms, bokashi. We tend to think of our soils as completely aerobic, but there are anaerobic pockets in it. And there's no question that EM, which is you know, essentially an anaerobic kind of mix, works, and so the lactus, you know, must be of some benefit. On the other hand, it's just one microbe. The reason why I like compost over effective microorganism material is because EM material contains 12 or 13 microbes, whereas compost contains, you know, 45,000 different fungi and, you know, 15 to 30,000 different bacteria. So the diversity that you get is so much better. So I wouldn't concentrate so much on one microbe. I would go for, unless it was a mycorrhizal fungi, I'd go for as many diverse microbes as you possibly can.
That's also fantastic. So this question is, do any of your books have soil building recipes or compost tea recipes?
Yes. I haven't read them in a while, but you know, they're all soil building. The second book contains tremendous numbers of different kinds of organic nutrient mixes that you'd make for different purposes. The first book obviously is about the soil food web. It talks about compost tea and how to make compost tea and composting as well to a certain degree, although it's not a composting book. And the third book does not. So yeah, I would say yes, they do. And I would also say to people, you know, as far to me, the first book, which has now been translated into, I think, 9 different languages, one of which is not an official translation. We did not approve the translation into Romanian. Romanian? I mean, my goodness gracious, you go on the internet, you can find a Romanian copy of Teaming with Microbes. And I hope it's being used very well in Romania. But anyway, I always tell people, that's a book that explains a system that's so integral and so important that as a grower, when you read that book, you cannot help but walk away a changed grower, period. And so what I tell people is, if you buy that book and you don't like it and it doesn't change your life, I'll buy it back at 3 times the price. Now, it's been through 15 or 20 different printings. It's in 9 different languages. No one has ever taken me up on it. That is a book that I guarantee. Don't buy it because I'm making any money on it, because I can assure you I am not making very much. Buy it, borrow it, you know, steal it, but read that book because it's really got the answers. It tells you the science behind organic gardening. And again, thanks to Tom Alexander, you know, for opening up my eyes, you know, and thanks to you guys for helping me spread the word, because it really is important that we use the soil food web, that we stop abusing the soil food web. And cannabis growers do. I mean, you know, we rototill. We use chemicals that are terrible. You grow a crop. I don't care how many of you know, Ed Rosenthal's books you read. You grow a crop commercially and it's got something wrong with it. You know, you do the Trumpian thing. You keep it probably, which is not a good thing. You know, we got to not do that kind of stuff, but that's what people do. So we got to pay attention to the soil food web so these things don't happen. Yeah,
that's fantastic too. So this is a really good 2-part question, but it's related to the same thing. And it says, do you recommend against using specific products when battling pests, fungus gnats, or etc. that you would avoid using as to not to damage the soil food web?
Yeah, I do. I mean, I can't think of any specifics right off the bat, but you know, I'm very careful about what fungicides I might use. I want to be very careful. Some of them will not impact mycorrhizal fungi. Some of them will wipe them out. I'm very careful about using Azomax. It's very, very powerful. It'll, you know, it kills beneficials as well as bad guys, you know, and not that it kills them all. And there are times when you really need it. You have to be extremely careful, and you got to be thinking about the future. This is soil you're going to use again, or someone's going to use it again. And so
the flip to that was, is there any products that you like to use when battling pests that do not kill the soil food web?
Yeah, I mean, I like to use members of the soil food web. And so the system is to figure out what your problem is, and then to figure out what the natural enemy of it is, then to figure out how to support the natural enemy and get it into the soil food web system. Biologics are fabulous. I live in Alaska. They're a little bit hard to get up here, but people in the lower 48 states shouldn't have any problem getting them. Those are the ones that really help the most. I mean, there's a there's a little critter that you can use in your hydroponic system, you know, that'll eat thrips and nematodes. Just goes nuts over them, you know. The thing just escaped my mind. Well, gee, you know, once you know what it is and where to get it, you're never without it. So finding biologics is the way to go. Live organisms that work because they're part of the soil food web. I think the best example I can give of that is the dung beetle. So the dung beetle, which is a phenomenal creature, I could, you know, study them forever. The dung beetle jumps onto a pile of cow shit. And when it jumps onto the pile of cow shit, it releases mites that it carries around with it. the mites take out the fly larvae that are also trying to eat the cow dung. They're the competition to the dung beetle. And then when the dung beetle makes its ball and gets ready to roll it into its burrow, it whistles and, gets the mites back on its body and goes away. It carries around its own biologics. And if you've got a good system, the soil food web carries around the biologics that you need in it. Whether it be an antibiotic that's being produced by a bacteria or what have you. It's an unbelievable system. And again, thank you, Tom Alexander, for introducing me to it.
You're welcome.
Yeah. He's such a good-looking guy, too. You know what I mean? There you go.
I was raised.
Any other questions?
Go ahead.
Any other questions?
No, not from the emails that we got. I have a
Well,
question. But
I did have one question, and that is, I got a feeling that you were implying that microbiologicals is all you need to release the nutrients in your soil or make nutrients available, but don't you need to have NPK to make them available? In other words, sooner or later, if you grew cannabis in the same soil, you would exhaust NPK.
Yeah,
And
well, I mean, I guess the answer
no matter
to that,
how much nutrients you put in, excuse me, how much soil life you put in, you're not going to get it. What you really need is maybe some green sand, some rock phosphate, some and nitrogen source of some sort.
right. I mean, and so here's how I approach that, and I discussed that in the second book. There is a theory among soil food webbies that you never need to use fertilizer because the microbes in the soil, A, contain nutrients, and B, retain those nutrients once they're released. They don't go into the water table or flow away. They're always in some kind of a body. And there's a lot of people who say that's just bunk. No, that's true. And it's true in a situation where you're not doing agricultural practices. So if
you have a heavy feeder like corn or like cannabis, then you probably are going to have problems.
Right, because what you're doing is you're breaking what's known as the law of return. The reason why you don't need to fertilize a redwood is because the things that drop from the redwood go down into the ground, get broken down, and feed the plant. So anything that's generated by the growth of the plant goes back into the plant. All the NPK is basically preserved because it's being decayed. But what we do, either in an agricultural system or in a cannabis system, is we remove the things that would normally replenish the NPK into the soil. So yes, you do have to add NPK at some point in time. There is not enough, I don't believe, in the microbes at some point in time to continue to feed the plants. And that's why you add organic inputs. And that's why the last couple of chapters of Teaming with Nutrients discusses the various kinds of nutrients that you would put in there and why you would need to have them. And again, that's something that's so very important. I mean, we talk about magnesium and why do you need the magnesium? Well, you need it because it's part of photosynthesis, and if you don't know that, you got to know all of this stuff. That's why this trilogy sort of makes sense for growing cannabis. When you put it all together, it tells you how you could get this plant to grow by itself, basically, which is what you want to have happen. You don't want to be working your ass off all the time. You don't want to destroy the bottom of the soil food web that feeds the plant, because that means you got to pay attention to your plants all the damn time. Well, that's limited fun.
But even the Native Americans going back hundreds of years knew to put a fish at the base of a maize plant to prevent nitrogen depletion, et cetera, et cetera. I've got an unusual thing. It kind of relates to flushing in that going to, the basic theory of Justus von Liebig with NPK, like Sam was talking about, and depletion and a whole bunch of other things. Wondering what your opinion on heavy metals. I believe besides carbon, water, basic fibrous materials, there's an actual mineral uptake and retention to a cannabis flower, be it those chemicals make up the essential oils, cannabinoids, whatever have you. I was wondering, basically we have an NPK, but there's also other whole host of iron, zinc, manganese,
Yeah.
Given the fact that, I mean, some people say it's an accumulator plant and it holds bad things. I'm wondering what they're referring to as far as bad things. Iron, zinc, manganese, check, check, check. It's got that. NPK, check, check, check. You're not going to flush them out. I agree with that. So that being the case, I'm wondering, if you could kind of like dispel the myth of let's call it heavy metal accumulation.
Yeah, well, there probably is some heavy metal accumulation if you're growing in soils that, or using a fertilizer that contains lots of heavy metals. But that accumulation.
But which minerals would you classify as heavy metals?
Well, I would say arsenic, for example.
Oh, well.
Maybe aluminum. Lead, yeah, definitely. But probably arsenic is the number one thing that people worry about getting accumulated. It probably gets accumulated in the cell wall system, not inside the cells themselves. It's an ionic thing, and so I'm not sure that you can separate the stuff out that easily. So again, there's all the more reason to be careful about what you're putting down, what you're using, knowing what your inputs are, et cetera, et cetera.
Well, I would doubt very many products on the market have lead in them and et cetera, right?
Well, you'd be surprised what you're allowed to put into fertilizer.
Sure,
we always say it takes years and years and years to
are made by the same factory that makes the milk for kids. It's all got lead in it for sure.
Yeah, or it's delivered by some, or it's in the packaging, or so you got to be really, really, really careful. But that's life in general. I mean, we're in that spot where we have to be careful. I think it's gotten a lot better. I think back in the day, everybody grew with chemicals. Period. That was just all that was done. Period. And at least now we're getting a lot.
I always knew many organic gardeners.
Good.
Well, you know what? This is something that I would like to say, like in the sense when I got to California in the early 90s and I first experienced Mendocino County and Humboldt in the early 90s, there was a whole push towards the organic hippie. Like I wasn't the only vegetarian on the mountain, so to speak. Good. And, this has changed a bit since we've seen the commercialization of cannabis and money kind of come into it and people just looking for chemical solutions to, their organic problems. And it sucks because I don't see the kind of stewardship of the land or the conservation efforts or the consideration that was once prevalent in the cannabis industry because most of my friends were hippies. And that's gone. And now we've got suits that just are like, yo, dump Miracle-Gro on it and call it a day. And I think it's kind of sad. So these kind of conversations, I think, are important for people to understand that there's two sides of this conversation.
Well, absolutely. And I mean, nobody wants to smoke stuff or vape stuff that's got pesticides in it. I mean, why would anybody want to do that? Why would the regulatory field allow people to sell stuff like that? I don't know. But it's, again, I understand. If you grow a crop and it's thousands and thousands of dollars, something happens to it, do you really want to destroy it? Well, yeah, you do. And that's the mindset we're going to have to get. And
that's why you would not be a good business person, because let's be honest, at least the majority of the people are not going to destroy it. Now, I would, you would. I'm sure Tom would.
Yep.
I'm sure Todd would. But most people, they're not going to destroy it.
Yeah, I don't know what we do about that. It's really a terrible, terrible thing. And
well, we're seeing widespread failure of pesticide use, and also things like microbutanol, which PGRs, and things that we really shouldn't see in cannabis. We're seeing more and more now. And thankfully, there are laboratories that are, in a way, acting as activists because there's, they're up against the same federal laws we're all up against, and they're doing the tests and they're exposing the fact that a lot of the cannabis that's on the market today, unfortunately, is not clean. And that's just an extension of people that don't want to lose money and won't do the ethical thing, which is throw away the crop if the crop is at a point where they can't sell it.
Yeah.
Well, after January 1st, when testing becomes mandatory here in California, you're going to get clean cannabis at dispensaries, and if the consumer wants dirty cannabis, they're going to go to the black market. But I think the pressure will even be on the black market to start testing and see what's in the cannabis that's on the black market. So I think it's going to become the pretty much the norm as consumers get educated.
Yeah, it should be.
It should be. When you go into a supermarket, you don't expect there to be, pesticides in your brownie or your loaf of bread. You really do expect the labels to be representative of what you get inside.
Well,
so we should have that with cannabis.
They do on food. They have acceptable levels.
Exactly. Yeah.
Well,
yeah, also the testing labs have gotten better in terms of being able to detect something like microbutanol, which before the growers had figured out what they could get away with that could pass the test, and now it's more stringent testing. So a lot of them are finding that their old practices aren't good enough to pass these tests. So that's going to change things too.
I think you're absolutely right. I think that also as people are coming out of the garden realizing that they're going to fall under scrutiny, that as soon as they hand this off to somebody, that person has the ability to take it to a lab, get it checked, and come back with results, they're going to realize that, the day and age of being able to BS their way through is coming to an end.
Right.
Yeah, and it better happen, because otherwise this is one of those areas that the antis can use as their rationale. It's not safe. You can't, it's got too much pesticide, blah, blah, blah. So if we don't self-police, they don't police, they shut down.
It can be done safely, easily. If nothing else, use contract growers for their organic. Doing this for years.
Well, you will see that. You will see certified organic farmers coming, when we get to a point where we have certified organic cannabis, which has got to happen, it will eventually happen. You're going to see a shift in the market. Look, I'm also for mids being sold cheap as could be. I'd love to see 89, cents a can in an ounce from Campbell's right at the supermarket, cannabis for everybody. And I think that would be great. But I think there's going to be a market for high quality organic cannabis for those of us who really enjoy smoking flowers, which is a lot of us. I still love it.
We're also going to end up getting crop insurance once the banking system's able to deal with cannabis. When you get crop insurance, which people will pay for, they'll get insurance so that if they lose their crop, at least they're going to get some compensation for it. Right now, you get nothing. So there'll be incentives built in as well. Hopefully, we as consumers, vote with our pocketbooks. That's the best thing we can possibly do.
Crop insurance would be phenomenal. That'll be the next big thing for sure.
It's coming.
It is. That's been available to agricultural farmers, I guess, for quite a while. When you said it, it kind of struck me as well, but I guess that is common.
After it becomes legal in California, it will, I think, Tom, correct me if I'm wrong, be California's biggest agricultural crop.
When it does become illegal, the biggest agricultural crop, because there's no way that it costs thousands of dollars to produce a pound of cannabis outdoors. I mean, the price is probably production costs maybe $100 a kilo or less.
Wow. So you're just saying the market is grossly overinflated due to the Prohibition era pricing that we're using as a baseline?
No, I would never say something like that, Todd.
Well, you know what? I'm one of the people that look forward to cannabis prices tumbling because I've had cancer and I know firsthand how beneficial cannabis is. So I personally would like to see it get into the hands of more people at prices that are just, as cheap as water. I would really love to see that happen.
Well, there's no fruit or vegetable that you can get $100 a kilo for. But I'm not even, regardless whether it's dry or wet. But yeah, because as soon as you start drying it or manicuring it, the prices go up the wazoo. But just growing it, yeah, it's not very expensive.
Well, I think that's going to be something that creeps into this, because the cost of production is going to have to become a big part of the conversation in legalization. Because if, you know, a farmer doesn't want to realize how much they're really producing that kilo or pound of cannabis for, their competitor will. And their competitor is going to come in at a price that's realistic to their investors, and that they're happy with their profit margins, and they're going to undercut everybody. Because I believe what you're saying is totally correct, and cannabis has been hyperinflated in the minds of so many for so long.
And the bottom line is people will grow Blue Dream, they'll manicure it by machine, and they'll whip it out really, really cheap.
Good, you know, and I hope there's a market for that. You know, at the same point, I think we're going to get to the conversation where this really is just about terpenes and cannabinoids. Like, the flower is just a carrier. I mean, and we really start realizing that, you know, it's not the prettiness of the flower that's helping me deal with my nausea from chemotherapy. It's the cannabinoids and the terpenes inside of that flower. It's those chemicals. And when we start looking at it from that perspective, well, then who cares if it's Blue Dream or train wreck or whatever? If those cannabinoids and terpenes in that combination are beneficial to you, well, then go for it.
Yeah, and what we're the most familiar with so far is high THC with specific terpene profiles. But people are also becoming familiar with high CBD or THC CBD mixes that have specific terpene profiles. But I mean, the learning can keep going on. Next, people will get wise to THCV or CBC. There's quite a few other cannabinoids that are next in line.
And one of the things I look forward to as legalization takes hold is having like personal growers trading their different varieties like we do with tomatoes. Like just yesterday, I grow up at a community garden. I grow 5 different heirloom tomatoes, and I traded varieties with this other grower that had different heirloom varieties than me. And I think that's going to become a popular thing where everybody's going to be trading varieties that they don't grow.
Except cannabis, maybe you need to trade clones, cultivars, because if you try trading seeds, not that many cannabis seed varieties
No,
are.
I wasn't talking seeds. I was talking buds,
clones,
finished flowers.
cultivars, yeah. Okay,
Well,
that's rocks and rolls.
No,
it's
after
interesting.
harvest.
When I used to live in Amsterdam 20 plus years ago, there was a large clone market. And now you go to Amsterdam and there's no clone market. You cannot go into a grow shop and buy cuttings like you used to. And now the only cuttings you can get is if you know somebody. And then you're not getting a menu. You're stuck with whatever clones they have. So it's changed considerably. And I think that as legalization develops here, you're going to see less and less of people trading proprietary varieties because they want to have a competitive advantage to their competitors. You know, if you're all selling Budweiser, it doesn't matter what 7-Eleven you stop at to buy that beer. But if every single 7-Eleven has got some type of microbrew beer, then they're unique. So it might be worth checking out the different shops. And I think that's what's going to happen with cannabis, because I don't know. I mean, cannabis isn't brand loyal, like where somebody would smoke Marlboros their whole life. People look forward to the next bag of buds being different and exciting and like, ooh, what's this one going to smell like? I think that's just part of the cannabis experience.
But that's on the commercial level. I was talking about on the personal grower level, where backyard growers are able to trade either finished flowers or clones for and obviously the commercial growers are going to want to keep proprietary and not share and only sell. But I think the personal backyard growers are going to just be sharing like the veggie growers do and like the home brewers do.
Or the grappa people. It's like grappa, Tom.
Yeah.
Not quite like grappa.
That's funny. What are some of the things that you've found, Jeff, that really do enhance cannabis in the flowering? Are there mineral combinations, or do you have a little secret sauce that you would like to share?
I don't. What I'm beginning to look at is, again, because I can now do the test, is I want to know what's going on with those exudates when the plant starts to flower. I want to try to figure out a test that can tell me when the plant is going to start to flower. And I've been told by a number of people who should know that the exudate numbers drop like crazy when the plant starts to flower. So it'd be fascinating to be able to kind of to track that all out. I don't use anything special for flowering because, to me, I want to. If you get the base plant, so it's just that first couple of weeks, to me, is the most important stuff. I grow a number of auto flowering plants. They are fast, and if you miss a couple of days and don't pay attention to them and miss watering them, or if they don't get light for a week because it's cloudy, man, you can see the difference. So I think it's just paying attention to the plant as it grows up until the point where it gets to flowering. I am certain that there are microbes that help. My problem is that people send me all sorts of microbes. I don't have enough time and room to test them all. I got a couple of growers in Oregon that are testing a couple of products right now, actually. One from South America, a bacterial mix called black bacteria. And it's supposed to increase bud yield by 30%. Well, we'll see. But again, it's hard to do.
Throw all the microbes into the compost mix.
Well, I've done that, but again, I'm only allowed to grow 6 plants legally here in the state of Alaska. So I got to find a soil commercial grower either here in Alaska to be able to do some testing for me. And that's sort of a big problem. Either that or become a commercial grower myself, which would be a lot of fun, but way too much work for this old guy. I can tell you that right now. And that's one of the nicest things about legalization of cannabis is it sure makes it easy to get.
Yes, I think that's the best part of legalization, that you're seeing cannabis more and more everywhere, and more people are coming out of the closet and being proud of the fact that they've associated with cannabis for so long. I was honestly thrilled that you, Jeff, was such an advocate of cannabis, and also such, ingrained in the other side of growing, which for a long time has kind of pushed us out of the way. Like what we were doing was illegitimate or worse, criminal. And, really we were just like endangered florists is all we really were.
Well, and the best growers in the world. I mean, there is no question that people who grow cannabis get into it and understand it in a way that people who grow tomatoes and other things don't.
Yeah, well, it touches our lives in a way that tomatoes don't, I believe. Dennis Perone caught, slack for saying that all use is medical use. And I, in a way, largely agree with that, because I think we all go through life dealing with our ups and downs and our own problems. And we don't know each other's inner problems. And cannabis comes along and it's this great neutralizer. It doesn't matter what happened. You kind of get to a point of being cool with it with cannabis. And it brings you up when you're feeling down. And even when you're too hyper, it brings you down when you're feeling too up. So I believe it's a really great thing. I've been an advocate for it for all of my life, pretty much since I started using it while I was a chemotherapy patient, because nothing like cannabis if you're on chemotherapy. And as soon as you use it, it's one of those wow moments that there's no denying the effect that it has is so positive.
Well, and there's no question that we need to be we need to come out of the closet. We need to be proud of the fact that we're dealing with this plant and the way we deal with it. We need to drop the stigma. We need to make sure that Jeff Sessions doesn't screw us up. We really need to just finally get people to understand it's just a plant, folks. It's no different than lettuce or a tomato or a carrot or an apple. People need to relax. All of the hysteria that it was built up by, Harry Anslinger and Hearst, we've got to just wipe that out. We've got to stop using the term marijuana, and we just got to stand up proud. I mentioned to you yesterday, when they legalized recreational cannabis throughout the state of Alaska, my editor asked me to write columns about it. That's really quite something. My book editor, Timber Press, insisted that I include a chapter on growing cannabis with the mycorrhizal fungi in the last book. This is a big change, but we're not there yet. I still go to parties where I've smoked individually, one-on-one, with everybody at that party, either in their house or my house. But at the party, nobody is using cannabis out in the open.
Collectively, they are still afraid.
We got to change that.
Well, here in California, it's a different scene, because every party I go to has
there you go.
A section. It may be off in the corner somewhere, but it's a pretty crowded section. And
there's always a group of guys in a circle.
Sometimes.
Yeah.
But especially with the guys I play hockey and softball with, they were, they're 40, 50, 60-year-olds. And once legalization happened, they were willing to try it and use it again.
Yeah.
And let me just say about Jeff Sessions, I mean, Tom published Sensimilia tips throughout the Reagan years, from 1980 until 1990. He outlasted the 8 years of Reagan, and I applaud you for that, sir. But none of their individual stupidities are ever going to be able to slow down cannabis. We have endured every dumb president through the 90s and into the 21st century. I mean, even Obama. I mean, I'm one of the producers on a movie called The Culture High, and one of the things we point out is that quietly, Obama spent twice as much on enforcing laws against medical cannabis as Bush did in half as much time, but it went unnoticed because, hey, he was the cool guy, and it wasn't being reported on. But the agenda of these politicians has been so overt, and it has been to disrupt us, because the truth is they're paid shills. They're all getting their money from big pharma or big oil or alcohol or tobacco or any other industry that has no interest in us being free. And the only thing that's actually freed us is direct democracy and our instigation to tell each other what we know about cannabis. So I believe that bringing this information forward has been the key to our freedom, and it's the only thing that will continue to unlock these doors.
And they're switching from supporting prohibition to this cash cow of taxing and licensing. The comparison to getting enter the market of alcohol and cannabis is like 6 to 10 times the amount of money. Here in California, a beer license is $15,000, but add up all the licensing and regulation fees for cannabis, it's $50,000, $60,000, $80,000. And it's total, they're going from prohibition to let's tax the shit out of it.
Well, and the way they're doing it is so screwed up. I mean, so if you're at a party and there are kids there and you're drinking a beer, you don't think twice about it. But you can't smoke or vape in front of kids under most of the laws that have been passed. I mean, we need to go back and change some of these things. So, for example, in Alaska, we passed the Marijuana Act. Well, we got to change the name of that. I mean, my God, what were we thinking? For goodness sakes, how could we let that slip by? The idea that you can't smoke at a bar, or vape, or that there's no place where you can congregate with other people. This is stupidness that that's a continuation of all of this prohibition silliness that's going on, and we're willing to accept it because we're at least getting our foot in the door. I think we're at the point now where our foot's in the door, the door's open. We need to open it all the way. We need to get rid of the stigma, and we just need to go. The problem is that opens up the door for big business, and lots of us are not really in favor of big business getting into this industry, but it's going to happen.
Well, it's definitely happening. And I think that as this progresses, though, you're going to see more people demanding equal rights in commerce, because why should we be treated differently than the wine industry? I mean, there really is no reason for it. It's just institutionalized bigotry, and we have to demand that it ends. And the overtaxation is only going to, help to keep the black market alive and well. And the difference between alcohol and growing cannabis is that, hey, my grandma can grow good cannabis, but she's probably not that good at making whiskey. So, you know, as we go forward with this, there's going to be a lot more backyard farmers that have nothing to lose than to throw a few plants in their backyard and go for it and find out they're good at growing. They're good at growing tomatoes, they're good at growing whatever else they do, and they're good at growing cannabis. So we're going to see more and more of this happen, which is only going to contribute to the devaluation of the stupid high prices that we've had to face, you know, with guns to our head, literally. So.
Yeah, well, you're beginning to see big gluts everywhere. I mean, Washington State, Oregon, gee willikers, and even here in Alaska, where we just literally started having sales from shops, the price has gone down 40% in the past month. So as more and more people get into it, but you know, Tom and I were scheduled. Tom couldn't do it, but so I had to do it. We gave a talk to garden writers about how to write about growing cannabis for lay people. So it's going to be happening. There's no question about it. We call it the next tomato. It is the next tomato. It's a gorgeous plant. It makes fabulous landscape shielding if you want it. It's got fabulous color if you want it. The flowers have color if you want them. You know, it's a plant that people enjoy growing. It has a use. It's easy to grow. And there's no question that once people can get seeds on an easy basis, and we've got some help right here, obviously, you know, then it is the next tomato. Everybody will grow a plant. It's just too much fun and too easy to do.
Yes, and I got to say, I love tomatoes, but that's nothing like cannabis, you know. So, somebody sent me another question, which I think is good, if you don't mind me asking. And they say, following harvest, what can we do to protect the soil and soil microbes over winter? You already suggested leaving the root mass in the soil. What else? Should we cover the soil, leave it exposed to the elements? Thanks again.
Yeah, well, you know, cover crops, of course, come to mind immediately. One of the reasons why a lot of the mycorrhizal fungi that you buy for cannabis growing contains more than one, you know, it contains other than the mycorrhizal fungi, which is called Rhizophagus interacetes. That's the one you want to have. A lot of these have 4 or 5 is because they'll associate with the cover crops that you plant. Cover crops are fabulous for creating soil structure, for adding mycorrhizal spores, for adding nutrients, and for adding exudates into the soil. So cover crops for sure. If you can't use cover crops, then because you want to have bacterial dominance, some kind of a straw or green mulch during the winter months when you're not using it. And when you're growing, you should certainly have mulch down. The only part that shouldn't have mulch is where the plant comes out of the ground. There are no bare soils in nature. There should be no bare soils in your cannabis garden. Period.
I use alfalfa hay for mulch. I love alfalfa.
It's wonderful stuff. It's coated with paramecium. It is spectacular stuff. It's got lots of nitrogen in it. It's terrific. Absolutely. No question about it. Hey, I say it this way. If it can feed a rabbit and keep a rabbit alive, it can do a great thing for your cannabis plants.
That is great. And, you know, do you have a feeling towards people moving away from animal-based nutrients like blood meal, bone meal, and such, and moving towards what they're calling vegan fertilizers?
Yeah, you know, I personally don't have a feeling one way or the other. I do think a little bit about GMO problems using the vegan side. You know, so when you buy soybean meal, which I think is a phenomenal microbe food, you know, you want to try to get it organic and be pretty expensive. Otherwise, you're buying GMO and you're supporting the whole system, et cetera, and spreading them out there. But yeah, you know, to me, I don't really have a feel one way or the other. I do have a feeling about manures. I get a little concerned about people using manures willy-nilly without thinking about 2 things. One is the E. coli, and 2 is the excess potassium and phosphorus. If you use too much manure, it doesn't matter what kind of mycorrhizal fungi you try to use, it ain't going to grow because there's so much phosphorus in the soil. You don't need, the plant won't set itself up into the mutual relationship. So that's the one I'm concerned about, is manures.
Do you think there'll be testing in the future where we're actually able to test what nutrient uptakes the plants are doing towards the end of their flowering or through their life cycle, so that we could more tailor the nutrients that we give to them?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the testing that's available now, again, is getting to be pretty phenomenal. You can do genomic testing. You can test RNA and DNA to determine specifically which things are in your organisms are in your soil at any given different time. They're not cheap, but they're going to get cheaper. There are more and more people like this lady who invented the microbiometer, and they're coming up with ways to test, because it is important to know this stuff. In the meantime, what we have to do is we have to correlate the existing tests we have, to what we want to measure and what's going on. And I think people are beginning to do that as well. So there's been such a change in instrumentation and the ability to be able to look at things with microscopes, and things have gotten cheaper even for scientific labs, so that even they have a different subset of how they can look at stuff than they had a couple of years ago. And photography and your ability to be able to, for example, take a look at your soil and take a picture of what's going on in your soil and have it appear on your computer instantly. Wow. It's just amazing.
Yeah, but also the correlation of your plant sap analysis, your ash analysis, combined with your nutrient use and how much in your runoff, how much was used, and things like that. We've never had these things at our fingertips where we could legally go to the lab and put a correlation together, form a database, and actually use factual data and science to lead us forward.
Right, absolutely. So yesterday I read a paper on this microbiometer, www.microbiometer.com, and it correlated the biometer tests with the tests that they use where they take the phospholipid, they take the phosphorus numbers that's in the cell wall, the cell membrane, and then they do a correlation. It correlated with the nitrogen numbers. It correlated with the carbon numbers. Fascinating, the number of tests that are out there that are just so complex and complicated that this thing can replace. Well, and the lady tells me she's going to be able to give you on your cell phone reading within the next couple of months the pH. Well, if you know the pH, you know whether your soil is dominated by bacteria or dominated by fungi. She's going to be able to tell us the phosphorus. Well, if you know you've got a lot of phosphorus in your soil, chances are, your plant, you got one of the big nutrients you have to take care of. It already tells you whether you've got C and N, because if you have a high number, you've got a lot of carbon and nitrogen in it. So all of a sudden, you got simple little tests that came out of nowhere that didn't exist a year ago that can tell you all this information. Think about what else is going to be developed, where you can be able to take a tissue and be able to tell, that it's missing chlorine. Wow. It's coming. It's going to definitely be coming, because we've got the little tool right here. This is the tool. This is what's going to change it all.
Yeah.
This woman, again, not to harp too much on this thing, she took this incredibly complicated testing situation where you had to use tubes and all these things, and she got this guy who's a specialist in it, and they came up with a series of color bars that go around the membrane. They just look like black and white squares to me, but they're so sophisticated that when you put the phone on it, boom, it can tell you down to the micrometer how much microbes are in that little cell. Gee willikers, pretty soon you're going to be able to use that phone to tell your diabetes numbers. You're going to be able to use that phone to tell your nitrogen number. You're going to be able to use that phone to tell everything. It's just happening. It's going to be here. It's coming. Boy, what a great time to live, huh?
It's true. The phone is just a computer, so it's just us to develop the interfaces for it, and it's absolutely true. We're going to be able to stick a little meter in the soil and know everything, and I think over time it'll probably get to a place where we can have individual meters that control drippers right at the plant, so that we're only giving it as much water as it needs. It's getting its dry time in. I mean,
we're there now.
We are there now.
Yeah. Yeah, or you can take a picture of a plant and see exactly what's going on inside the leaf. That there's an area that's been damaged, or that there's an area that's the things that are coming. I mean, with vibrations, with all sorts of things that the phone is now going to be able to measure as Apple and other people start to get into this stuff, which they are. One of the interesting things about Apple I heard is that when they built the spaceship down there, their new facility, they had to landscape it. Well, all of a sudden, a big sector of the executives in Apple became interested in soil and plants and where do you get them and what's sustainable and what's going to be happening with the increase in temperature, because we want to have these things last 150 years. So what's going to be like? So they've started looking at climate change, all of these things, just because they were landscaping their area. Well, the flowback's going to come into our iPhone some way, and we're going to be able to use it as cannabis growers, which is just a phenomenal thing. It's a great time to be living again.
I agree. And thank you so much for joining us today, Jeff. It's been an educational experience, and I've really enjoyed every minute of it.
Well, not as much as I. You guys are, my idols and famous. I read your books and been following you. And
well, this is the Mutual Admiration Society.
Indeed.
Well, I was going to say I can't think of a better bunch of felons to be associated with.
That is a well way to put it, bro. Multiple felons, actually, but only for growing
terrific
cannabis.
show you got here.
You're not
the
a
only
felon
thing I've ever been prosecuted for. Right?
It's what's in your heart that counts.
Right.
Love and organic fertilizer. I would love you to come on anytime. I mean, you're a perfect addition to the panel. To all your friends and peers. And if ever you have time, Jeff, you're always openly invited to join us.
You send me the link and I'll be there.
That is fantastic. It's really great to meet people that you look up to and they'd be so cool. And thank you for being one of those people.
Well, certainly my pleasure. And let's do this again. No question about it. And again, I got to send a big shout out to Tom Alexander. I wouldn't be here today if it wasn't for Tom Alexander. He is the man. Thank you, Tom.
You're welcome. And I feel the same about all of you.
Same here. Kudos, each and every one of you. And thank you, Todd, for having me. It's been a blast.
Yeah, it's always great. I want to shout out to someone that always helps in our chat. Her name is on it, 70s Mama. It's her birthday today, and she's always so cool, and she moderates for us. And I want to say thanks, and everyone else is watching, thank you very much for tuning in and Talking Cannabis today. It was a great experience to be on with all of you, and we'll be on next Saturday. I think Nick will be joining us.
I believe so.
Yeah, from Red Eye. Red Eye was one of the magazines in the UK.
A representative of the magazine named Zorro, who did all the incredible tales and journeys.
Okay, so forget everything I just said. We'll go with that. All right. Well, thank you, everybody, for joining us today. And until next Saturday, Talking Cannabis.